Don't lie to me, Brandon. Who the hell is counting down the hours for the cabin with red silk and Pinot Noir? The words shot out of my mouth before I could stop them bouncing off the cold marble wall of our Manhattan bathroom. For a second, everything went still, like the city itself had paused, holding its breath right along with me. I'm Jessica Miller, 35 years old, financial controller at one of the most cutthroat tech firms on Madison Avenue. By day, I'm respected, decisive, the woman executives come to when they need complex equity reconciliations explained in plain English. But by night, I'm the wife of a man whose secrets light up my phone screen with a glow I can't unsee. And the longer I stare at those glowing words, the more it feels like my entire life has been a lie, built on perfectly balanced spreadsheets and polite smiles at corporate parties. I'd gotten up early that morning, restless. The sky outside our penthouse windows was still that bruised purple shade before dawn. Brandon was still in bed, tangled in our high thread count sheets, breathing slow and steady, like he didn't have a care in the world. I stood at the double vanity sink toothbrush, halfway to my lips, when his iPhone plugged in on the marble counter lit up. And there it was, one preview of a message I wasn't meant to see. Can't wait for the cabin. The red silk, the Pinot Noir, counting down the hours. My hand froze in midair. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Familiar, playful, intimate. A tone I hadn't heard from him in months. And for a second, it felt like my entire body emptied out. Like I'd stepped outside myself and was watching some stranger in a cream silk robe trying to process the crack in her world. Outside traffic started to pulse and honk. On Fifth Avenue, the city waking up like normal. But in our apartment, there was nothing normal about that morning, because suddenly every late-night business dinner, every locked laptop screen, every time Brandon turned his face away when I reached for him in bed, all of it snapped into focus like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle finally slamming into place. I didn't want to believe it. I kept telling myself, "Don't be dramatic, Jessica. People drift. Marriage is hard. You've been working crazy hours. Maybe he's just tired." But my gut had been screaming for months. And now, with just one message on a locked screen, I knew I wasn't paranoid. I was right. That was the exact moment my perfect Manhattan life split in two. And in that split second, I realized I would rather torch everything than live another day pretending not to see what was right in front of me. I wish I could tell you I slammed the phone into the wall that morning, that I screamed demanded answers ripped off my wedding ring right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at that single glowing notification until the screen went black. Then I rinsed my mouth, fixed my hair, and pulled on a navy sheath dress like it was my armor, and stepped out into Manhattan like nothing was wrong. My name is Jessica Miller, 35. Raised in upstate New York, the kind of kid who memorized multiplication tables before first grade. Now I'm a financial controller at D&H Technologies, one of the fastest growing software companies in the city. My days are spreadsheets, liquidity reports, cross-border equity, reconciliations. I speak in terms like hedge fund exposure, asset, rollover risk, and pipeline revenue. To the world, I'm sharp, precise, always in control. But the truth, for months now, my life has felt like a glass skyscraper, shiny on the outside, hollow, and echoing on the inside. And the man who helped build that illusion is my husband, Brandon Miller. Brandon is 38, tall, dark-haired, bright blue eyes that always reminded me of summer. He's a marketing director for an elite digital media firm on Park Avenue. Everyone who meets him says the same thing: he's so charming. And he is. He's the man who brings craft cocktails to the party and knows which bottle of wine will impress the CEO's wife. He's the man who once stood on the roof of a Brooklyn brownstone at midnight, reciting the lyrics to Your Song by Elton John, while I laughed so hard I cried. But lately, he's felt miles away. He started coming home later, started sleeping closer to the edge of the bed, started guarding his phone like it held the nuclear codes. And the worst part, I kept making excuses for him. Until this week. Until that message. There's also Sophie Carter, 39, gorgeous in that confident, sharp-edged way. She works as an HR consultant for several high-profile Manhattan firms. We used to know each other back at Columbia. Not close friends, but enough to share coffee on campus, swap study notes, talk about internships. I haven't seen her in years, but now she's suddenly the name glowing on my husband's phone. And she's married too, to Eric Carter, 42, a senior site supervisor in construction management. Tall-built like the kind of man who can carry beams across his shoulders without breaking a sweat. Eric's the kind of guy who's probably got calluses on his hands and a soft spot for dogs and old trucks. A solid man, a man who looks like he builds things that last. And just like me, he has no idea what his spouse has been hiding. Our story stretches across Manhattan's glass towers, into the Catskill Mountains where Brandon and Sophie planned their secret weekend escape. A place we used to go, a cabin with a roaring fireplace windows. Looking out over pine trees and rolling mist, I thought it was our special place, but now it's where my entire marriage is about to come crashing down. And for the first time in my life, all the numbers in my spreadsheets can't save me from what's about to happen next. Looking back, I realize the signs were always there. They started as small cracks, hairline fractures running through the surface of our life. At first, it was Brandon working late. He's in marketing, so late nights happen. Pitch decks, last-minute client dinners. I kept telling myself that. But then the excuses piled up. One Tuesday night, he came home at nearly 1 a.m, smelling of whiskey and cedarwood cologne. That wasn't his usual brand. He mumbled something about a partner dinner. But when I asked who was there, he couldn't remember. I brushed it off. Because that's what you do when you love someone, right? You protect the story you've built. Then there was his phone. At first, he used to leave it lying around, face-up notifications, blinking like Christmas lights. But then one evening, I caught him changing his passcode in the middle of the kitchen. 4 digits became 6. And suddenly, he started taking it with him everywhere. To the shower, into the closet, even when he stepped out just to take the trash downstairs. Little things began gnawing at me. His laptop, which once opened easily under the soft glow of our living room lamp, now demanded a fingerprint I didn't have. New bank statements arrived in the mail. Thicker envelopes than usual. He'd close tabs on his browser the second I walked past, and when I'd ask him what he was reading, he'd shrug. Just sports stuff, he'd say. Except, Brandon doesn't even follow sports. One night, I found an Uber receipt in his suit pocket, a ride from Midtown to Greenpoint at 11:45 p.m. on a Thursday. Greenpoint isn't anywhere near his office, or ours, or the bars where his colleagues usually go. And the fare was expensive, a long ride. When I confronted him, he stared at me like I'd just accused him of murder. "Jess, you're acting paranoid," he said. It was a work drop-off, a client's place, but he couldn't tell me the client's name. He couldn't remember the address. That's when the ache in my chest began to spread like ice. But the worst was the silence between us. It wasn't the loud fights. We didn't throw plates, didn't scream. We just stopped talking. At dinner, he scrolled through his phone, smiling at messages he wouldn't show me. Sometimes he'd look at me like he couldn't see me at all. and I started to feel invisible. Some nights I'd lie awake staring at the city lights splattered across our ceiling, wondering if he was lying beside me or if he was already gone. Part of me wanted to snoop, but another part, the part that still wanted to believe in us, held me back. Until that text on his phone finally shattered every excuse I'd ever made. Because when a woman writes to your husband about red silk and Pinot Noir, there's no spreadsheet in the world that can explain it away. I didn't plan to look at his phone that morning. I swear, I wasn't one of those wives who snooped through messages or tracked locations. But the universe, or fate, or pure cruel coincidence decided otherwise. Standing there in our bathroom, the toothbrush still in my hand, I watched Brandon's iPhone light up on the marble counter. One simple preview, a single thread of words that snapped my entire life in two. Can't wait for the cabin, the red silk, the Pinot Noir, counting down the hours. It wasn't the words themselves that hit me like a punch to the ribs. It was the intimacy, the inside jokes, the easy comfort, the way she said counting down the hours. Those were the kind of words you send someone who already knows your secrets, who's touched the softest parts of you. And it wasn't me. Mamselle! My entire body felt like it was vibrating, a high-pitched buzz in my ears. And somewhere beneath the panic was the cruelest part of all, relief. Because for months, my gut had been screaming at me. And now, I finally knew I wasn't crazy. My hands felt cold against the marble sink as I set down the toothbrush. I didn't unlock his phone. I didn't need to. The truth was already staring me in the face. Brandon was cheating on me, and whoever she was, she had plans with him for the cabin we used to call ours. The same cabin in the Catskills where we'd spent our anniversary 2 years ago, where we'd sat by the fireplace drinking bourbon and dreaming about buying property upstate, where he'd once promised we'd build a life big enough to hold both our careers. And maybe, one day, a family. I remembered that weekend, the crisp pine air, the way the stars looked like crushed diamonds against the black sky, the softness in Brandon's voice when he told me he loved me. Now that cabin felt poisoned. Suddenly, it wasn't our place anymore. It was their place. And just like that, everything we'd built felt like a facade. The business dinners, the charity galas, the rooftop photos smiling for Instagram. All of it, a beautiful cover for secrets he thought I'd never uncover. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I felt my mind click into a cold, terrifying clarity. The way it does when I'm balancing a multi-million-dollar ledger and find a number that doesn't add up. Because that's who I am, a woman who finds the discrepancy and follows it to the truth. So I wiped my face, fixed my lipstick, and walked out of the bathroom to find Brandon adjusting his tie in front of the bedroom mirror. He glanced at me, smiled like nothing had changed. He didn't know I'd just watched our marriage shatter into dust. He cleared his throat. I've got a client retreat up in Connecticut this weekend. Won't be home till late Sunday. I stared at him, my voice flat. Don't forget a coat. It's cold at night there. He nodded, oblivious. But as he turned away, a new thought slammed into me. This wasn't just between me and Brandon. Someone else was living a lie too. So I walked back to the bathroom, sat on the closed toilet seat, and typed a name into Google I hadn't thought about in years. Sophie Carter. And there she was, a polished LinkedIn profile, human resources consultant, bright smile, strategic people operations leader, married to Eric Carter, senior site supervisor, 42, sustainable architecture, based in Brooklyn. One smiling family photo, a husband, a wife. No idea their lives were about to implode. And in that moment, I realized I couldn't just let this go, because secrets don't stay hidden forever. And this one was about to blow everything apart. The rest of that morning passed in a blur. I went through the motions, hair makeup, black pumps clicking over marble floors. But my mind wasn't in Manhattan anymore. It was back in that cabin, back in the woods, back with a husband whose hands I suddenly realized hadn't touched me with true affection in months. I sat at my glass office desk, staring at my dual monitors filled with columns of numbers, revenue forecasts, equity splits, profit projections, but every number looked meaningless now. Because my marriage wasn't a spreadsheet. It couldn't be reconciled. My phone sat beside my keyboard. Its dark screen might as well have been a black hole. My fingers hovered over the glass. Over and over I told myself not to do it. Don't involve someone else. Don't drag another person into this hell. But the words from Sophie's message kept flashing in my head. Red silk, Pinot Noir, counting down the hours. And I thought of Eric Carter, a man I barely knew, a man whose entire life was about to tilt off its axis. So I took a deep breath and typed, "Hi, Eric. I know you don't know me personally. I'm Jessica Miller. I believe your wife Sophie and my husband Brandon are having an affair." I stared at those words for nearly a minute. They felt like razor blades pressed into my fingertips. I deleted the message, rewrote it, deleted it again. My pulse thundered in my ears. The entire office seemed too quiet, like everyone could somehow hear my thoughts. Finally, I hit send, and instantly, I felt like I might vomit. My palms were slick with sweat. My throat felt too tight to swallow. Minutes ticked by, each second stretching out like an eternity. Then, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But some part of me knew who it was. When I picked up, his voice was low. "Rough, is this some kind of joke?" I closed my eyes. I wish it was, I whispered. "I have messages, screenshots, times, places. They're planning a weekend in the Catskills, a cabin. I can prove it." There was silence on the other end, then a long, shaking breath. "What do you want to do?" Eric finally asked. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. "I don't know," I said. I can't let them go there pretending everything's fine. I can't sit at home while they laugh and drink wine and pretend we don't exist." Another pause. Then Eric said softly, "I want to see what you have." My voice trembled. Would you be willing to meet me?" "In person?" "Yeah," he replied. "Yeah, I think we should." We picked a place halfway between New York and the Catskills, a little diner in New Paltz. Neither of us said much else before hanging up, and as I sat there staring at my reflection in my blackened phone screen, I realized there was no going back. I'd just detonated the first bomb in a war neither of us wanted, but both of us needed. The diner in New Paltz looked like it had been there since the 70s. A squat little building with a flickering neon sign that read, "Home of the Best Pie in Ulster County." Inside it smelled like burnt coffee and cinnamon rolls, and the Formica tables were chipped along the edges like they'd witnessed 1,000 secrets before ours. I arrived early, too early. I claimed a corner booth by the window facing the parking lot. My fingers wouldn't stop drumming against the plastic menu. Every few seconds, I'd glance up, half hoping Eric wouldn't come, half terrified that he would. Then I saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy work jacket dusted with sawdust even on a Saturday. His hair was dark blonde, cropped close, and there were faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind of lines that come from squinting into bright sunlight or holding in too many secrets. He stepped inside, scanning the booths, and when our eyes met, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. No words, just that nod. He slid into the seat across from me, his big hands resting on the table, fingers curled slightly, like he was bracing for impact. Neither of us spoke at first. A waitress appeared cheerful and oblivious, dropping off water glasses and coffee we hadn't even ordered. I wrapped both hands around my mug just to steady them. Finally, I pushed my phone across the table. I need you to see this. Eric picked it up, his thumb swiping slowly through the screenshots I'd saved. Every word between Sophie and Brandon. The jokes, the plans, the promises about the cabin. He didn't say a thing, but I watched the muscle in his jaw twitch with each new message. When he reached a photo of a wine bottle labeled Reserve Pinot Noir, he exhaled so sharply it made the napkin holder rattle. I thought she was working late, he said, voice low and ragged. Or at yoga, or, God, anywhere but this. He set my phone down carefully, like it was something fragile that might explode. For a moment, we just sat there, two strangers bound together by the same devastation. I took a shaky breath. I don't want revenge, I said. I'm not looking to scream or trash anyone's life. I want them to see us. I want them to realize they can't hide this anymore. Eric stared at me silent, then nodded once. That's fair, he said. No yelling, no cops, no drama, just the truth. He rubbed a hand over his face. I still have a spare key to the cabin, he said finally. Sophie doesn't know I kept it. My eyebrows shot up. You do? Yeah, I designed part of the deck for the old owners. Before Sophie and I bought it years ago, I kept the key for emergencies. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So, we get there first, I said. Set the scene. Make them walk in and see us waiting. No shouting, no violence. Just make them look us in the eye. Eric gave a humorless half laugh, like a surprise intervention for cheaters. I couldn't help it. I almost smiled. Exactly, I said. An intervention for liars. He nodded slowly, eyes distant. Okay, let's do it. But we do it clean. We don't lower ourselves to their level. I swallowed. Agreed. Outside, a truck rumbled past the window, sending vibrations through the coffee cups. Inside that diner, Eric and I sat across from each other, two strangers plotting the most intimate confrontation of our lives. Neither of us wanted this war, but both of us were ready to finish it. We left the diner that afternoon with a plan. But even as I climbed into my car, my pulse wouldn't slow. The highway stretched ahead, gray and wet, under a curtain of rain. But all I could see were the words I'd read on Brandon's phone. Red silk, Pinot Noir, counting down the hours. It was like those words had branded themselves into my brain. Halfway back to the city, my phone buzzed. A text from Eric. There's something I didn't say earlier. We should talk again before we go to the cabin. My stomach dropped, because the last thing I wanted was more secrets. But the last thing I could handle was walking into that cabin without knowing everything. We agreed to meet in a quiet corner of Washington Square Park. It was raining just enough to keep most people away. The fountain gurgled softly in the distance, and the pavement glittered under the street lamps like spilled diamonds. Eric stood waiting under the arch rain, dotting his jacket. He looked tired, older than he'd looked in the diner just hours before. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stepped closer. You said there was something else. He rubbed the back of his neck, hesitant. Sophie didn't just know Brandon through work, he said. She knew you. My breath caught. I knew she and I went to Columbia at the same time, but we weren't close. Eric gave me a look. That's not what Sophie told me. The rain kept falling around us, soft and steady. Eric took a deep breath. Last year, we went through a rough patch. Sophie started talking about the past a lot. She told me that back in college, she had feelings for someone, a woman. My mouth went dry. Eric swallowed. Jessica, it was you. My mind reeled. Me. That's insane. We barely knew each other. We were in a few classes. That's it. Eric's voice was quiet. Sophie said you were the first person who ever made her feel seen. She said you were the reason she even got into HR. Because you were always so organized, determined, like you knew who you were even at 20. I stared at him. The rain was cool on my cheeks, but I hardly felt it. Eric kept going. I think the affair wasn't just about Brandon. I think part of her wanted to be closer to you, even if it was sideways, through him. I shook my head, trying to process the words. That's insane. But the memories started bubbling up. Late nights in the campus library, Sophie leaning closer than necessary, laughing a little too hard at my jokes. The day she gave me a tiny silver bookmark with my initials engraved on it. At the time, I'd thought she was just friendly. Now I wasn't so sure. I whispered, so all this time, she's been circling my life. Eric nodded. I'm not excusing what she did, but I think you should know. Because it might change how you see her, how you talk to her when we're all face to face. I pressed my palm to my forehead. I can't believe this. This complicates everything. Eric's eyes were kind even in the rain. I'm sorry. I just didn't want you blindsided. For a few moments, we stood there in the drizzle, not speaking. The city lights flickered around us, and somewhere deep inside me, a question began to form. Was I part of this triangle all along? And I never even knew it. The drive upstate felt like the longest of my life. Trees blurred into dark shapes outside the windshield as Eric and I wound deeper into the Catskills. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a silver mist hanging low over the hills. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to detonate. Eric's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway, tires crunching on wet stones. And then, there it was. The cabin, nestled among towering pines, wooden beams dark with rain, windows reflecting the pale gray sky. It looked exactly as I remembered, and yet completely different, because now it wasn't our getaway. It was ground zero. Eric killed the engine. Neither of us moved for a few seconds. Then he turned to me, voice low. You ready? I forced a nod, though my stomach felt like it might cave in. Yeah, let's do this. Inside the cabin smelled like cedar and old fireplaces. Eric flicked on a few lamps, casting warm pools of amber light across the wood floors. Everything was neat. The leather armchairs, the coffee table, the stone fireplace with a stack of logs waiting to burn. I remembered sitting there with Brandon, sipping bourbon, laughing about how we'd retire up here one day. Now every memory felt tainted. I helped Eric set the stage. He uncorked a bottle of Pinot Noir, Sophie's favorite. I pulled out 4 crystal glasses and lined them up on the table. We placed 2 chairs facing away from the front door, forcing anyone who walked in to face us directly. Eric disappeared into the bedroom for a few minutes. When he came back, he held up a thick manila envelope. Printouts, he said quietly. Screenshots, bank statements, photos, everything. I swallowed. Good. They can't deny what they see. Eric sat down across from me, elbows resting on his knees. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was the silence of people who understood each other in a way no one else ever could. The clock on the wall ticked louder than I'd ever heard it. Outside, wind whispered through the trees. I checked my watch. 5:53 p.m. Eric said, they're supposed to arrive at 6. I nodded. My chest felt tight, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. Eric's voice dropped lower. How do you think this will go? I exhaled slowly. Sophie will cry. Brandon, I'm not sure. He'll probably try to talk his way out of it. Or get angry. Eric's eyes were hard. He has no idea both of us know everything. I gave a dry laugh. That's the only thing I'm looking forward to. At exactly 5:59, headlights swept across the cabin windows. Eric and I exchanged a single silent look. Then we sat up straighter. No words. No instructions, just ready. Outside, car doors slammed. Voices floated through the crisp air. Laughter, carefree, like they were arriving for a romantic weekend. not about to watch their worlds implode. Brandon's voice rang out first, and you should have seen the look on my boss's face. Then the front door swung open, and Sophie stepped inside. She froze mid-laugh, eyes going wide. Brandon bumped into her back, nearly dropping the gift bag in his hand. He looked up, and our eyes met. Time stopped. The bottle of champagne he was carrying rolled out of the bag and shattered against the wood floor, spilling frothy bubbles across the cabin. Sophie blinked rapidly, one hand flying to her mouth. Brandon's face drained of color. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. Then I said, voice soft, but slicing like glass, "Welcome to your weekend getaway." Eric's voice followed low and steady. "Please sit down." Sophie hesitated, eyes darting to Brandon, as if silently pleading for him to fix this. Brandon swallowed hard, jaw clenching. "Jess, this isn't what you think." I tilted my head. "Oh, then explain the texts, the cabin plans, the receipts from Greenpoint, the wine she calls her favorite." Brandon took a step forward. Just listen to me." "No," I cut in. "You listen. I've spent months listening to lies. Tonight, you're going to hear the truth." Eric stood up slow and controlled. "Sam Asventost." "Sophie, who's Jason Carter?" Sophie flinched. That's my brother." Eric's voice was cold as steel. "Why did you transfer 10 grand to a rehab facility under his name and tell me it was for a roof repair loan?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want you worrying." Eric shook his head. "No, you didn't want me knowing. Just like you didn't want me knowing about this." Brandon suddenly turned to me, his voice desperate. "Jess, it didn't mean anything, I swear. It was just excitement, a distraction. I never stopped loving you." My eyes burned as I stared at him. "If the love you're talking about involves bringing another woman to the same cabin where you promised me a future, then I don't want it." Sophie covered her face, shoulders shaking with sobs. Eric looked at her like he was seeing a stranger. Brandon dropped into one of the chairs, burying his face in his hands. I opened Eric's envelope and began laying photos and printouts on the table. Every detail, I said. Dates, messages, hotel confirmations. Everything you both thought you were hiding. Sophie lifted her head, voice trembling. "Jessica, I swear, I never meant for it to go this far." My voice came out low. "It went exactly as far as you chose to take it." Eric leaned in. "You know the worst part, Sophie. You thought we weren't strong enough to handle the truth. You thought we were too small to deserve honesty." The room went quiet again, filled only with the soft ticking of the clock and the scent of spilled champagne soaking into the floorboards. I folded my arms. Tonight isn't about revenge. It's about reality. And the reality is, you two built your affair on secrets, and secrets don't stay hidden forever. Brandon lifted his head, eyes glistening with tears. "Jess, please, don't end this." My lips parted, but the words that came out weren't what I'd rehearsed 100 times. "Brandon, it's already over." And for the first time in months, I felt free. For a long moment after I said it was over, nobody spoke. The air inside the cabin felt sharp like breathing glass. Brandon's shoulders slumped forward in the chair, his head hanging low. Sophie stared at the table, silent tears streaking her cheeks, her breathing shaky and uneven. Eric stood behind his chair, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles went white. I started gathering the papers off the table, folding each piece of evidence back into the envelope. I just wanted it all to be done. But then Sophie sucked in a trembling breath and whispered, There's something else I need to say." Her voice cracked on the words. I froze mid-motion, the envelope half closed in my hands. Eric stiffened. Brandon lifted his head, eyes bloodshot. What he rasped. Sophie swallowed so hard, it was audible in the quiet room. Her eyes flicked to me, then to Eric, then back again. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, it didn't even register. It was like the words hung in the air without sinking in. Eric blinked slowly, as if trying to process what he'd just heard. Brandon sat up straighter, his face draining of all color. "What did you say?" he croaked. Sophie nodded, tears pouring down her face. I found out last week. I was going to tell you this weekend. But then this happened." She wiped at her cheeks with trembling fingers. Brandon's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. Then he managed, voice raw. "Is it mine?" Sophie let out a choked sob. She looked at Eric, then back at Brandon. "It's Eric's," she whispered. "I'm sure. Brandon and we were always careful. But Eric and we didn't. We weren't." Her voice broke completely, dissolving into sobs. Eric staggered back a step, his hand flying to his mouth as though he might be sick. His face was pale, stunned, eyes wide and hollow. "Oh my God," he muttered. "Sophie, are you serious?" She nodded, crying so hard she could barely speak. "I know it's not the right time. I know this is a disaster. But I can't hide it anymore." Brandon was shaking his head over and over his hands, raking through his hair. "You're telling me you're pregnant with his baby?" Sophie flinched. "Brandon, I'm sorry. I never wanted it to get this far. I thought I loved you. I thought maybe but She turned her tear-soaked face toward Eric. "I never stopped loving you, Eric. I was angry. I was lost. I did this terrible thing. But I swear, I still love you." Eric just stared at her like she'd become a stranger. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "A baby? Jesus, Sophie." Sophie stepped closer to him, sobbing. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm not even asking you to stay. But I had to tell you the truth." Eric's eyes shone with unshed tears. He turned away, rubbing his hands over his face. The silence stretched so long it felt like it might swallow all four of us whole. Finally, Eric spoke. "I don't know what the hell happens next. I don't even know who you are right now. But if there's a baby, I'm going to do right by that child. The baby didn't ask for any of this." Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know. And thank you for even saying that." Brandon stared at the floor, shaking as if he might fall apart. Right there in the cabin, my own heart was hammering so hard, it felt like it might crack my ribs. I whispered, "So all this time, you were hiding not just an affair, but a child." Sophie lowered her head, her voice muffled. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I swear. I never wanted to hurt either of you." My voice came out cold as ice. "Then you should have stayed away from my husband." Eric looked at me, his eyes full of sorrow. "This changes everything, Jess." I nodded, swallowing back 1,000 emotions. "Yeah, it does." And in that instant, the war we'd planned to wage tonight became something bigger, because now there was an innocent life hanging in the balance. The room felt smaller than ever. The glow from the lamps cast long shadows across the wooden floor, flickering over spilled champagne and scattered petals from the flowers Sophie had dropped. Brandon sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. Eric stood off to the side, staring blankly out the window as the last traces of daylight faded beyond the trees. Sophie wiped her eyes over and over mascara streaks, like war paint across her cheeks. I took a long, slow breath and felt something harden inside me. I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim folder of crisp white papers. When I laid it on the table, the sound was louder than a gunshot. Brandon flinched at the noise. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to mine. "What's that?" he whispered, voice raw. I held his gaze steady. "It's our divorce petition." Sophie let out a tiny gasp. Eric turned from the window, eyes widening. Brandon blinked rapidly, as if trying to process words in a language he'd never heard. "Jess, come on. You can't mean that. We can work this out. We've been through worse. We can go to therapy. Please. I shook my head once, calm, resolute. There's no coming back from this, Brandon. I might have forgiven one mistake. But this? I gestured towards Sophie, 2 entire lives blown apart. Lies layered over lies. Plans behind my back. And the woman who was supposed to be just your colleague, carrying another man's child. All while you were sneaking around with her in our cabin. Brandon reached for my hand. I pulled it away before his fingers could touch mine. His voice cracked. I love you, Jess. I know I messed up. But don't throw away everything we built. Don't throw away us. I felt a sting behind my eyes, but I refused to let the tears fall. Everything we built is already gone, I said quietly, because you weren't building it with me. You were building it with your secrets. He opened his mouth to argue again, but I cut him off. You always said trust was everything, and you destroyed it. And love without trust, is just a beautiful lie. Sophie sobbed into her palms. Eric stood silently watching me with quiet respect. I flipped open the folder and pulled out a pen. All our assets have been documented and separated. The apartment, the savings accounts, the stocks. I'm not trying to ruin you financially, Brandon. I'm just trying to free myself. He stared at me, shaking his head. Please, Jess, don't do this. I signed my name at the bottom of the first page. The pen glided smoothly black ink, sealing the end of 12 years of my life. I placed the pen in front of him. You can sign it now, or you can take it to your lawyer. But either way, I'm done. Brandon's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked like a man drowning in the middle of dry land. Eric stepped closer and spoke softly. You're strong as hell, Jessica. I managed a faint smile. Not strong, just finally awake. I glanced at Sophie. She stared back devastated, still clutching her stomach, as if to protect the life growing inside her. I took one last look at Brandon, the man I used to believe was my forever. Then I picked up my bag, straightened my shoulders, and walked out of the cabin into the cool dark night, free. The cabin door closed behind me with a solid final thud, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped off the porch, carrying away the smell of spilled champagne and broken promises. I didn't look back. Not once. 2 months later, the divorce papers were finalized. Brandon didn't fight it. Maybe because he knew dragging it out would only expose more lies. Or maybe because he finally understood that I was done pretending. The settlement left me comfortable. I kept the condo in Manhattan, my savings, my stock options, and I walked away from my marriage with something far more valuable, my peace. I could have taken time off, traveled, hidden from the world for a while, but instead, I threw myself into work because that's who I am. A woman who turns pain into power, a woman who makes spreadsheets sing. But this time, I didn't want to go back to corporate life. I didn't want fluorescent lights and 14-hour days, and pretending to laugh at bad jokes in conference rooms. So, I started my own business, Miller Financial Resilience Group, a boutique consulting firm focused on helping women navigate the financial chaos that often comes after divorce. Asset restructuring, retirement account rollovers, tax implications of settlements, emergency funds. I took every brutal lesson I'd learned and built a business out of it. My first client was a woman in her 40s, blindsided by a husband who drained their joint accounts and run off with a 25-year-old Pilates instructor. I sat with her in a cafe on the Upper West Side, listening as her hands trembled around a paper coffee cup. By the end of our session, we'd built her a new budget, reclaimed control over her credit, and found a way for her to stay in her apartment. When she hugged me with tears in her eyes, whispering, "I thought I'd lost everything." but I think I'm going to be okay. It felt better than any quarterly bonus I'd ever received, because now my numbers were changing lives, and for the first time in ages, so was I. But even with my new business thriving, there was still a small part of me that wanted something softer, something that had nothing to do with ledgers or spreadsheets or legal filings. Something just for me. I remembered a dream I'd buried years ago, a dream Brandon used to laugh off as impractical. I used to imagine owning a little bookshop cafe, tucked into a quiet street, the smell of roasted coffee beans, mingling with the scent of fresh pages, sunlight spilling across wooden floors, jazz humming softly in the background, people coming in not just for a latte, but to find a piece of themselves on a shelf. So one morning, I drove north along the Hudson River and found the perfect spot in a small town where the streets were lined with brick buildings and flower boxes overflowing with color. I signed the lease the same day, and 3 months later, Harbor Light Books and Brew opened its doors. Now, every morning I flip the sign to open. Steam curls up from cappuccinos I craft behind the counter. Locals linger over novels. Tourists wander in for scones and end up talking to strangers at the community table. Sometimes I run my financial workshops right there in the shop, helping women find their footing while the smell of cinnamon rolls fills the air. It's peaceful. It's joyful. It's mine. No one tells me my dreams are unrealistic anymore because I'm living them. And every time I watch someone walk out my door, holding a book and smiling, I know I've built something real, something true, a place where healing and new beginnings are always on the menu. Some nights, when the shop is quiet and the last customer has gone home, I sit by the front window of Harbor Light Books and Brew, a mug of chai warm in my hands, and I watch the headlights roll past on the wet streets outside. And I think about how close I came to losing myself completely, to staying in a life that was killing me. Slowly, one lie at a time, I think about the woman I used to be, the one who believed love meant sacrifice, that forgiveness meant swallowing your own truth, that silence was safer than asking the hard questions. But I'm not her anymore, because I've learned that love, real love, doesn't demand you shrink to fit inside someone else's secrets. Trust isn't a luxury, it's the foundation. Without it, love is just an illusion wrapped in pretty words and fancy dinners. I've learned that sometimes walking away isn't weakness. It's the purest kind of strength. It's the moment you choose yourself over a life that no longer fits, over a person who stopped fighting for you long before you ever knew the war had started. People always ask me if I regret it, if I regret leaving, if I regret burning it all to the ground. And I tell them, no, because sometimes the fire clears the way for something better, something real. And the truth is, some people come into your life to show you how to stay. Others come to teach you how to leave. Either way, they shape who you become. So if you're listening to this, and you're standing at the edge of your own decision, wondering whether to stay or whether to go, let me say this: you deserve the kind of love that doesn't ask you to erase yourself. You deserve the kind of life where your secrets are safe, because there are no secrets. And you deserve to be chosen every single day by someone else and by yourself. Have you ever stayed longer than you should have? What did it cost you? And what did it teach you?